Caleb Mercer stood in his pressed Sunday shirt at the edge of the dirt road, holding a single wildflower he'd picked that morning. The whole town watched. The stagecoach rolled in 20 minutes late, and when that door swung open, every soul in Red Creek held their breath. No white dress, no gloves, no bride. Instead, a woman in a dust coat and a gun belt stepped down, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "You're Caleb Mercer, and you're in more trouble than you know." If you want to know what happened next, subscribe to our channel, follow this story to the very end, and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled. Caleb didn't move. He stood there with that wildflower hanging at his side like a fool's flag, and the woman in front of him didn't blink. She had dark hair pulled tight under a worn hat, and her eyes carried the kind of weight that didn't come from reading books or writing letters. Her hand rested on the butt of a Colt revolver like it lived there. "I said you're in trouble," she repeated. Caleb swallowed hard. "Ma'am, I don't know who you are. My name's Vivian Hale, and the woman you've been writing to, Clara Bennett, she ain't comin'." The whispers started before she even finished the sentence. Caleb could feel them like heat off a stove. Mrs. Pruitt clutched her Bible tighter. Old Henry at the general store leaned against his post and shook his head slow. Deputy Warren Cole, standing near the telegraph office, didn't whisper at all. He just watched. And the way he watched made Caleb's stomach turn cold. "What do you mean, she ain't comin'?" Caleb kept his voice low, but it cracked on the last word. Vivian stepped closer, close enough that only he could hear. "Your letters were intercepted. Every one of them. Clara never read a single word you wrote after February. And the men who want her land? They think she's already married to you." Caleb stared at her. "That don't make any sense." "It makes perfect sense if you think about who profits." Vivian tilted her chin toward the deputy. "That man over there. He's been watching you since before the coach pulled in. You notice that?" Caleb didn't turn. He didn't need to. He'd felt Cole's eyes for weeks now. Small things. The deputy riding past his fence line at odd hours. Questions at the feed store about his silver claim paperwork. A casual mention at the saloon about Eastern women who inherit land they don't deserve. "I ain't got a silver claim," Caleb said. "No, but Clara does. And somebody's gone to a whole lot of trouble to make sure she ends up either married to you so they can take it through you, or dead in a ditch somewhere between here and Missouri." The wildflower slipped from Caleb's fingers. He looked at this woman, this stranger with dust on her boots and a revolver on her hip, and something inside him shifted. Not trust, not yet, but the ground beneath him, which had felt solid that morning when he'd shaved and put on his good shirt, now felt like river sand. "Who sent you?" he asked. "Clara did. Last thing she managed to get out before they moved her." "Moved her where?" "That's what I'm here to find out." The crowd was growing restless. Caleb could hear Reverend Macklin clearing his throat, preparing some kind of pastoral intervention. Mrs. Pruitt was already whispering to the woman beside her, and the word "scandalous" floated across the hot air like a horsefly. Caleb straightened his back. He was a big man, 6'2", wide shoulders, hands built for fence posts and horse reins. But right now, he felt about 3 inches tall. Every person in Red Creek had known about his mail-order bride. He'd told them himself, proud as a new father, because after 4 years alone on that ranch, after burying his mother and watching his brother ride off to California, he'd finally done something about the silence. And now, the silence was louder than ever. "You better come with me," Caleb said quietly. Vivian raised an eyebrow. "That an invitation or an order?" "It's the only thing I got right now, ma'am." She studied him for a long moment. Then she gave one sharp nod. They walked together toward his wagon, and behind them, the whole town of Red Creek buzzed like a kicked hive. Deputy Cole was leaning against the hitching post outside the sheriff's office when they passed. He tipped his hat with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Caleb, that your bride?" Caleb kept walking. "Afternoon, Deputy." "She don't look much like a bride." Cole pushed off the post and fell into step alongside. "She looked more like trouble to me." Vivian didn't slow down, didn't speed up, didn't look at him. "Ma'am," Cole said louder now, "you got business in Red Creek?" "I got business with Mr. Mercer," Vivian said without turning. "And last I checked, that ain't a crime in Wyoming territory." Cole's smile tightened. "No, ma'am, it ain't. But carrying that much iron into a peaceful town might raise some questions." Vivian stopped. She turned to face him, and Caleb saw something in her eyes that he recognized. The look of someone who had been questioned by men like this before, and had stopped being polite about it a long time ago. "Deputy," she said, "I've been riding 3 days in July heat. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning, and I just delivered news that no woman wants to deliver, and no man wants to hear. So if you've got questions, you can write them down and bring them to Mr. Mercer's ranch tomorrow morning. I'll answer every one." Cole's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. "Tomorrow, then," he said. He didn't move as they climbed into the wagon. He just stood there in the middle of the street, and Caleb felt those eyes on his back all the way to the edge of town. The ride to the ranch took 40 minutes. Neither of them spoke for the first 20. Caleb held the reins and stared at the road. The summer grass on either side was burnt gold, and the sky stretched out in that endless Wyoming way that used to make him feel free, and now just made him feel exposed. "How'd you know Clara?" he finally asked. "I was hired to escort her from St. Louis to Cheyenne. Pinkerton job." "You're a Pinkerton?" "Was. Courier, mostly. Escorted documents, witnesses, sometimes women traveling alone." Vivian paused. "Clara was supposed to be simple. Pick her up, get her on the westbound coach, make sure she arrived safe." "What happened?" "2 men showed up at the boarding house in St. Louis the night before she was supposed to leave. Said they were lawyers representing a mining company. Had papers. Said Clara's inheritance, the silver land her father left her, was under dispute and she couldn't travel until it was settled." Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. "Was it under dispute?" "Not a word of it. I checked. Her father filed that claim clean and legal before he died. No liens, no partners, no debts. That land is hers, free and clear. But these men, they had a judge's signature. Or something that looked like one. Forgery? That's my guess. Clara got scared. She told me about you, about the letters, about the marriage arrangement. She said you were a good man." Caleb's throat tightened. "She said that?" "She said you wrote about your ranch like it was a living thing. Said you told her about the creek behind the barn and the way the light hits the mountains at dawn." Vivian looked at him. She said any man who writes like that about land instead of money is worth trusting. Caleb didn't say anything for a while. The wagon creaked, and the horses blew, and the grasshoppers sang in the tall yellow grass. "So she sent you instead," he said. "She sent me to warn you. Because whoever's behind this, they already know your name. They know about the marriage arrangement, and they're planning to use it." "Use it how?" "If you marry Clara, her land becomes yours under territorial law. Then all they got to do is pressure you, or remove you, and the claim transfers. If you don't marry her, they'll find another way. Forge a deed, bribe a judge. They've already got a deputy in their pocket." Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop at the ranch gate. He sat there, looking at the house he'd built with his own hands. The porch he'd sanded smooth, the garden fence he'd put up, because Clara had written that she loved flowers. "I built that fence for her," he said quietly. Vivian followed his gaze. Something softened in her face, just for a second, before she locked it back down. "I know," she said. Inside the house, Caleb set a kettle on the stove, and Vivian sat at the kitchen table with her hat off. Her hair fell past her shoulders, darker than he'd first thought, and there was a scar along her left jawline that she made no effort to hide. "I got a spare room," Caleb said. "It was supposed to be, well, it don't matter what it was supposed to be. You can use it. I won't be here long. You said Cole's coming tomorrow with questions, and I'll answer them. Then I'll ride out." Caleb poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her. He sat down across the table and looked at her straight. "Miss Hale, I'm going to ask you something, and I need the truth. I ain't giving you anything else. Is Clara alive?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Vivian wrapped both hands around the cup. "When I left St. Louis, she was. She was scared, but she was alive. I promised her I'd get word to you, and I'd come back for her." "You promised?" "I did." "And you keep your promises?" Something crossed her face. Pain, old and deep, the kind that doesn't heal clean. She looked down at the table. "I used to think so," she said. "Then I lost someone I was supposed to protect. A witness. Young woman, barely 20. I was escorting her to testify against a railroad company. They got to her before I could." "Got to her how?" "She disappeared. They told me she changed her mind and went home. But there was no home to go to. I looked for 6 months. Never found her." Caleb was quiet. "That's why I took the job with Clara," Vivian said. "Because I ain't losing another one." Caleb nodded slowly. He understood something about carrying weight. He'd carried his own since the night his family's farm burned in Kansas. Since he'd stood in the ashes at 16 years old and decided that if the world was going to take everything from him, he'd build something it couldn't reach. But here it was, reaching. "Those men in St. Louis," Caleb said. "They work for someone here." "That's my thinking." "Horace Dillard." Vivian looked up. "You know the name?" "Everybody in Red Creek knows Horace Dillard. He owns the hotel, the mining supply store, and half the grazing land between here and Laramie. He's on the town council. He donates to the church. And every man who's ever stood in his way has either sold out or moved on. Or worse? There was a rancher 2 years back, name of Parsons, had a water claim that Dillard wanted. One morning, Parsons' barn caught fire. A week later, his cattle broke through a fence that had been cut clean with wire snips. A month after that, Parsons sold his land to Dillard for half what it was worth and moved his family to Oregon. And nobody said anything? What's to say? No proof, no witnesses, just bad luck. Caleb's voice carried an edge now. That's how Dillard works. He don't come at you with a gun. He comes at you with patience. He waits. He squeezes. And by the time you realize what's happening, you're already packing. Vivian set her cup down. "Well, I ain't packing. Neither am I." Their eyes met across that kitchen table, and something passed between them that neither one named. It wasn't romance. It wasn't even trust, not fully. It was recognition, the way 2 people who've been alone too long can look at each other and see the same bruises. "We need proof," Vivian said. "If Dillard's behind the intercepted letters, behind the fake lawyers in St. Louis, behind Cole's little visits to your fence line, we need something solid, something a judge would look at." "I might have something." Vivian raised an eyebrow. Caleb stood and went to a drawer beside the stove. He pulled out a stack of letters, the ones he'd received from Clara, the ones that had arrived regularly until February, and then simply stopped. "Look at the postmarks," he said, spreading them on the table. "January, February. Then nothing. But I kept writing, sent a letter every 2 weeks, like we agreed. And not one of them ever got answered. Vivian picked up the last letter. She held it to the lamplight and studied the edges. "This envelope's been opened and resealed," she said. "See here? The glue line's uneven. Someone read this before you did. That letter said Clara was having second thoughts. Said maybe she wasn't ready to come west after all." Caleb's voice dropped. "I believed it. Spent 2 months thinking I'd been a fool." "You weren't a fool. You were being played." "Same thing where I come from." Vivian almost smiled. Almost. "No, Mr. Mercer. A fool doesn't notice when a deputy rides past his fence at midnight. A fool doesn't keep letters that don't add up. You noticed. You just didn't know what you were noticing." Caleb sat back down. "So what do we do?" "Tomorrow, Cole comes asking questions. We give him just enough to think I'm nobody, a hired hand, a courier, someone passing through. We don't show him the letters. We don't mention Clara's land. And then? Then I ride to the telegraph office in Miller's Crossing, 20 miles east, out of Cole's reach. And I wire my contact in St. Louis. Find out where Clara is. Find out who those lawyers really work for. And we start building a case that even Horace Dillard can't buy his way out of." Caleb looked at her. This woman who had ridden 3 days through summer hell to deliver bad news to a stranger, who carried a revolver like a second heartbeat, and spoke about justice like it was something she still believed in, even after losing. "Why?" he asked. "Why what? Why do this? Clara ain't your blood. I ain't your business. You could have sent a telegram and stayed in St. Louis." Vivian stood. She walked to the window and looked out at the land, his land, stretching gold and quiet under the fading sky. "Because I made a promise," she said. "And because the last time I broke one, a girl disappeared, and nobody cared enough to look for her, except me." She turned back to him. "I ain't losing Clara Bennett. Not to Dillard, not to Cole, not to anyone." The kettle whistled. Caleb pulled it off the stove. Outside, the first stars appeared over the Wyoming plains, and somewhere on the road between Red Creek and town, the sound of hoofbeats echoed, slow, deliberate, circling. Someone was watching the ranch, and the night was just getting started. The hoofbeats circled twice more before they faded. Caleb stood at the kitchen window with his hand on the rifle hung above the doorframe. He didn't pull it down. Not yet. But his fingers knew the weight of it, and that was enough. "One rider," Vivian said from behind him. She hadn't moved from the table, but her hand was on her Colt. "Came from the South Trail. Circled wide. Didn't want to be seen, but didn't try too hard to hide either." "You caught all that from in here?" "I caught all that from the sound. 2-beat gait, shod horse, heavy rider. He wasn't scouting. He was sending a message." Caleb turned from the window. "What message?" "That they know I'm here, and they want you to know they know." Caleb let out a long breath. He sat down across from her again and rubbed his face with both hands. 24 hours ago, his biggest worry had been whether the wildflowers he'd picked would wilt before the stagecoach arrived. Now he had a missing bride, a corrupt deputy, a woman with a gun at his kitchen table, and somebody circling his ranch in the dark like a vulture. "Get some sleep," Vivian said. "I'll take first watch." "This is my house, Miss Hale. I'll take my own watch." "You always this stubborn?" "Ma'am, I've been ranching alone for 4 years. Stubborn's about all I got left." Vivian studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Fine. Wake me at 2. And Mercer, don't stand in front of windows." She picked up her saddlebag and walked to the spare room. She stopped at the door. "That fence you built," she said without turning around. "The one for Clara's flowers. What about it?" "It's good work." She closed the door behind her and Caleb sat alone in the kitchen with the lamp burning low and his rifle across his knees, listening to the silence that had become something different now. Not lonely, but dangerous. He didn't sleep. At 2 o'clock, he knocked on her door. Vivian opened it, fully dressed, boots on, gun belt buckled. She hadn't slept either. Neither of them said a word about it. Dawn came hard and bright. The heat was already pressing down before the sun cleared the ridge, and by the time Caleb had the horses watered and the stove lit, sweat was running down his back. He cracked 4 eggs into the skillet and put coffee on, and when Vivian came out of the spare room, she'd washed her face and tied her hair back, and for just a second, just a flash, Caleb saw someone underneath the armor. Someone tired. Someone carrying more than a saddlebag and a revolver. Bennett was gone, and Vivian Hale was all business again. "Cole will come before noon," she said, sitting down. "He'll bring questions he already knows the answers to. That's how men like him work. They don't ask to learn. They ask to see if you'll lie." "So we don't lie." "We don't lie about the things that don't matter. I'm a courier. I brought a message from Clara saying she's delayed. That's it. Nothing about intercepted letters. Nothing about Silver. Nothing about Dillard." "And if he pushes?" "Then I push back. That's what I do." Caleb set a plate in front of her. She looked at it like she hadn't expected it. Like the simple act of someone cooking for her was a foreign thing. "Thank you," she said quietly. "It's just eggs, ma'am." "I know what it is." They ate in silence, and it was the most comfortable silence Caleb had felt in longer than he could remember. Cole came at 10:30. He didn't come alone. He brought a man Caleb had seen around town but never spoken to. Tall, thin, with a clerk's coat and ink-stained fingers. The man carried a leather folder and stood 2 steps behind Cole like a shadow. "Morning, Caleb." Cole leaned against the porch rail like he owned it. "Ma'am?" Vivian stood in the doorway with her arms crossed. She'd left her gun belt inside. A calculated move, Caleb realized. She wanted Cole to think she was cooperating. "Deputy," she said, "I brought Mr. Pettigrew here. He's a notary for the county office. Just need to ask a few questions and get some things on record. Standard procedure when a stranger comes to town carrying iron." "I left my weapon inside," Vivian said, "as a courtesy." "Appreciated." Cole pulled a small notebook from his vest pocket. "Now, Miss Hale, was it?" "Vivian Hale." "And your business in Red Creek?" "I was hired to deliver a message to Mr. Mercer from Miss Clara Bennett in St. Louis. Miss Bennett has taken ill and won't be arriving as planned. I was passing through the territory on other business and agreed to deliver the news in person." "Passing through to where?" "Cheyenne. I have work there." "What kind of work?" "Private courier service. Documents, parcels, messages. Licensed through the Pinkerton Agency, though I'm no longer employed by them directly." Cole wrote slowly, deliberately, like each word was a stone he was placing in a wall. "And you plan to stay in Red Creek how long?" "A day or 2, until Mr. Mercer has had time to compose a reply to Miss Bennett, should he wish to send one." "That's real charitable of you." Cole looked up from his notebook. "Riding 3 days in this heat just to bring a man bad news." "Miss Bennett offered to pay for my time." "How much?" "That's between me and my client, Deputy." Cole's smile went tight. He glanced at Pettigrew, who hadn't said a word, then back at Vivian. "You know, it's funny. I was at the telegraph office yesterday, and there wasn't any wire from St. Louis about Miss Bennett being sick. No message to Caleb at all. Seems like if a woman was too ill to travel, she might have sent a telegram instead of hiring a stranger with a gun." Vivian didn't flinch. "Miss Bennett doesn't trust telegrams. She's a private woman. That's her right." "It is," Cole said. It surely is. He tucked the notebook away and straightened up. His eyes moved past Vivian to Caleb, who stood just inside the front room with his hands at his sides. "Caleb, you doing all right?" "I'm fine, Deputy." "Must be a disappointment, waiting all that time for a bride and getting, well," he gestured at Vivian with a lazy hand, "something else." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Is there anything else you need?" "Not today," Cole tipped his hat. "But I'd recommend your guest not wander too far from the ranch. Red Creek's a small town. People talk. And some of those people talk to me." He turned and walked back to his horse, Pettigrew following like a thin, silent dog. They mounted up and rode back toward town without looking back. Vivian waited until they were out of sight before she exhaled. "He knows," she said. "Knows what?" "More than he's letting on. That bit about the telegraph. He checked. Before he even came out here, he checked. That's not a deputy asking standard questions. That's a man building a case." "Against who?" "Against us. Against anything that threatens whatever Dillard's got planned." Vivian stepped off the porch and looked toward the road. "I need to get to Miller's Crossing. Today. Before Cole figures out a reason to stop me." "I'll drive you." "No, you stay here. If we both leave, there's nothing stopping someone from riding onto this property and planting whatever they want. A forged deed, a stolen claim marker, anything. You stay and you don't let anyone pass that gate." Caleb didn't like it. Every part of him, the part that had been raised to protect, the part that had watched his mother die because no one came in time, rebelled against the idea of sending this woman out alone on a road where someone had circled his ranch in the dark just hours ago. "Miss Hale." "Vivian." He stopped. She'd said it simply, without weight, but it changed something. "Vivian," he said. "That rider last night, if they're watching the ranch, they're watching the roads too." "I know." "And you're still going." "I've ridden worse roads with worse men behind me." She walked toward the barn. "I'll take the creek trail east. It adds an hour, but it stays off the main route. I'll be back before dark." "And if you're not?" She paused at the barn door. "Then you take those letters to the judge in Laramie yourself. Don't wait. Don't look for me. You get Clara's claim on record before Dillard can bury it." "I ain't just gonna, Mercer." Her voice was iron. "I didn't ride 3 days to save one person, just to get 2 people killed. If something happens to me, you finish this. Promise me." Caleb stood there, and the morning sun beat down on both of them, and the whole quiet weight of what they were doing, what they were risking, settled between them like dust. "I promise," he said. Vivian saddled the mare and rode out through the back pasture, following the creek bed east. Caleb watched her until she disappeared behind the ridge, and then he was alone again. But alone felt different now. He spent the morning working. Fence rail that had been cracked needed replacing. Water trough was low. He hauled buckets and drove nails and sweated through his shirt, and the whole time his mind was turning like a wheel. Clara Bennett. A woman he'd never met, but had written to for 8 months. He'd told her about the creek and the mountains, and the way the coyotes sang at night. She'd told him about her father's library, and her mother's garden, and the sound of rain on a tin roof in Missouri. They'd built something on paper, not love, not yet, but the scaffolding of it, the possibility. And someone had torn it down before it ever had a chance. Around midday, a wagon pulled up to the gate. Caleb set down his hammer and walked over. It was Ruth Calloway, who ran the boarding house in town. She was 60 years old, with hands like leather and a spine like a fence post, and she didn't suffer fools. "Caleb Mercer," she said from the wagon seat. "I brought you a pie and some information, and I ain't sure which one you need more." "Ma'am?" "Get up here and talk to me. I ain't climbing down in this heat." Caleb climbed up beside her. She handed him a cloth-wrapped pie that smelled like apples and butter, and then she looked him dead in the eye. "That woman you've got staying here, the one with the gun." "She's a courier, Mrs. Calloway. Brought a message from—" "I know what she told people. I also know that Warren Cole spent an hour in Horace Dillard's office last night after the stagecoach came in. Door closed, curtains drawn, and when he came out, he sent 2 telegrams, one to Cheyenne and one to a place I couldn't read because the clerk turned the paper over when he saw me looking." Caleb's blood went cold. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I remember your mama, God rest her. And because I remember what Dillard did to the Parsons family, even if everybody else in this town has decided to forget." Ruth's voice was steady as stone. "I don't know what that woman is really doing here, Caleb, but I know that whatever it is, Dillard is scared of it. And anything that scares Horace Dillard is something I want to see succeed." "Mrs. Calloway, if anyone finds out you came here—" "Then they find out an old woman brought a pie to a neighbor. Nothing more." She picked up her reins. "You watch yourself, and you watch that woman. She strikes me as the kind who'd walk into a fire to pull someone out, and forget she's burning too." She drove off without another word, and Caleb stood at the gate, holding a pie, and feeling the ground shift under him one more time. Cole had gone straight to Dillard, within hours. That meant Dillard already knew about Vivian, already knew his plan had hit a snag. And the telegrams, one to Cheyenne, one somewhere else, those were orders, instructions, the machinery of a man who didn't get his hands dirty, but made sure the dirt got done. Caleb carried the pie inside and set it on the table next to Clara's letters. He spread them out again and read them in order, from the first one in October, warm, curious, hopeful, to the last one in February, distant, guarded, and now he could see it, forced. Someone had written that last letter. Maybe Clara under duress. Maybe not Clara at all. He picked up the February letter and held it to the light like Vivian had done. The resealed glue line was visible now that he knew to look for it. Such a small thing, a thin line of dried paste where the envelope had been carefully opened and closed again. Someone had read Clara's words before Caleb ever saw them. Someone had held this letter in their hands and decided what truth Caleb Mercer was allowed to have. The anger that rose in him was quiet and deep, like water finding a crack in rock. He folded the letters carefully and put them in his breast pocket, close to his chest. Then he loaded his rifle and sat on the porch and waited. The afternoon crawled. Heat shimmered off the ground, and the horses stood in whatever shade they could find, and the world was still in that heavy, breathless way that comes before something breaks. At 4 o'clock, a rider appeared on the main road. Not from the east, where Vivian had gone, but from town. Caleb stood up, rifle in hand. It was a man he didn't recognize. Young, maybe 25, with a new hat and a horse that was too good for a drifter. He rode up to the gate and stopped. "Mr. Mercer?" "Who's asking?" "Name's Tom Shipley. I work for Mr. Dillard at the mining supply. He wanted me to bring you a message." "I'm listening." Shipley reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed envelope. He leaned down and held it out. Caleb didn't take it. "What's in it?" "I don't read Mr. Dillard's mail, sir. I just deliver it." "Set it on the fence post and ride on." Shipley hesitated, then placed the envelope on the post. He tipped his hat and turned his horse back toward town. Caleb waited until he was a quarter-mile down the road before he picked up the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Expensive paper. The handwriting was precise and careful. Mr. Mercer, it has come to my attention that the circumstances of your intended marriage have become complicated. I understand your disappointment. As a gesture of goodwill, I would like to offer you fair market value for your ranch and its adjoining acreage. The enclosed figure reflects my genuine assessment. I believe you will find it more than reasonable. Should you wish to discuss this offer, I am available at my office at your convenience. Respectfully, Horace Dillard. The enclosed figure was $3,000. Caleb's ranch was worth 5 times that, and Dillard knew it. Caleb read the letter twice. Then he folded it and put it in his pocket with Clara's letters. This was how it started. This was exactly how it had started with Parsons. A polite letter, a reasonable offer. And behind it, the unspoken promise that things would get very unreasonable very fast. He walked inside and poured himself a cup of cold coffee and drank it standing up. Then he sat down and wrote his reply on the back of Dillard's own letter, in pencil, in large, plain letters. Mr. Dillard, no. Caleb Mercer. He sealed it in an envelope and set it on the kitchen table. He'd send it in the morning. The sun was dropping low when he heard hoofbeats from the east. His hand went to the rifle, but something in the rhythm, steady, purposeful, unhurried, told him before he saw her. Vivian came around the ridge on the mare, dusty and sunburned, but upright. She rode through the back gate and dismounted at the barn without a word. Caleb met her there with a canteen. She drank long and deep, then wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "I got through," she said. "Wired my contact in St. Louis. He'll have news within 2 days." "Any trouble on the road?" "No, but someone had been on the creek trail before me. Fresh tracks. Single rider, heading east. They knew that trail existed." "Could have been anyone." "Could have been. Wasn't." Caleb handed her Dillard's letter. She read it once, then looked at him. 3,000. "I know." "He's testing you, seeing if you scare." "I wrote him back." Caleb showed her his one-word answer. Vivian stared at it. Then something happened that Caleb hadn't seen before and wasn't prepared for. She laughed. A real laugh, short and sharp, like a door swinging open to a room she kept locked. "Well," she said, "that ought to do it." Mrs. Calloway came by today, brought a pie and some news. Cole went to Dillard's office last night, closed-door meeting, and Dillard sent telegrams, one to Cheyenne, one to somewhere she couldn't see. The laugh was gone. Vivian's face hardened. Cheyenne. That's where the Territorial Records Office is. If Dillard's wiring Cheyenne, he's trying to get ahead of the claim registration. Can he do that? If he's got someone inside the records office, he can slow it down, misfile it, lose it, buy himself time. Time for what? Time to make Clara disappear. Not killed, that's too messy, too many questions. But moved, pressured, married off to someone he controls, or declared incompetent by some bought judge, and her land rights transferred to a guardian. Vivian's voice was cold and precise, the voice of someone who had seen these mechanisms before. Dillard doesn't need to own that silver claim himself. He just needs to make sure Clara can't. Caleb felt the anger again, that deep, cracking rock kind. What about the other telegram? The one Ruth couldn't see? Could be anything. More hired men, a lawyer, someone to deal with me. Vivian said it flatly, like it was a weather report. Which means we're on a clock now. Whatever we're going to do, we do it before those telegrams turn into people on horseback. What do you need from me? Vivian looked at him, and for the second time that day, Caleb saw something behind the armor. Not weakness, something closer to surprise. like she hadn't expected to be asked that question. Like she was used to doing everything alone and had forgotten that another way existed.
"I need you to trust me," she said, "even when it doesn't make sense. Even when it gets worse before it gets better. Can you do that?"
Caleb looked at this woman, this stranger who was no longer a stranger, who carried scars she didn't hide, and promises she wouldn't break, and a laugh she kept locked away like something precious. "I reckon I can," he said. Vivian nodded once. She picked up her saddlebag and walked toward the house. "Vivian," she stopped. "There's pie." She turned, and for just a second, just a breath, the corner of her mouth lifted. "Then I'll stay for pie." They ate on the porch as the sun went down, and the sky burned red and gold over the Wyoming plains. And somewhere out there, in the gathering dark, Horace Dillard was reading a one-word letter and learning something he should have known from the start. Caleb Mercer wasn't going anywhere, and neither was the woman sitting beside him. 2 days passed like holding your breath underwater. Caleb worked the ranch. Vivian watched the roads. They fell into a rhythm that neither of them talked about, but both of them felt. Him up before dawn to feed the horses, her already awake with coffee made and her colt cleaned and loaded on the kitchen table. They ate together. They planned together. And in the spaces between, they learned each other the way people do when danger strips away everything polite and leaves only what's real. On the morning of the third day, Vivian rode to Miller's Crossing again. She came back at noon, and Caleb knew something had changed before she even dismounted. It was in the way she swung off the mare. Fast, hard, like the ground had personally offended her. "What happened?" "My contact in St. Louis wired back." Vivian pulled a folded telegram from her coat. Her hand was steady, but her voice wasn't. "Clara's gone." Caleb's chest went tight. "Gone how?" "Gone as in moved." 2 men showed up at her boarding house 4 days ago with a court order signed by a Judge Whitfield in St. Louis County. Said Clara was being relocated to a sanitarium in Kansas City for evaluation of mental fitness.
"Mental fitness?"
That's the game, Mercer. You don't kill the woman. You don't need to. You just declare her unfit, put her in a place where nobody can reach her, and her property rights transfer to a court-appointed guardian. Vivian slammed the telegram on the porch rail. 3 guesses who petitions to be that guardian. Dillard.
Not Dillard himself. He's too smart for that. A man named Franklin Yates, attorney out of Kansas City. But my contact checked. Yates has handled 4 land transactions for Dillard's mining interests in the last 2 years. He's Dillard's man.
Caleb sat down on the porch step. His hands hung between his knees, and he stared at the dirt, and he felt something he hadn't felt since he was 16 years old, standing in the ashes of his family's farm. That helpless, burning fury of watching something wrong happen and not being able to stop it.
"Can we get her out?"
"Not from here. Not yet." But the wire said something else. Vivian crouched in front of him.
"Clara fought back. She refused to go quietly. Made a scene in front of the whole boarding house. Told everyone within earshot that she was being taken against her will, and that men were trying to steal her father's land in Wyoming."
Good for her.
Better than good. The boarding house owner, a woman named Margaret Price. She's a Methodist with a backbone. She wrote down everything Clara said, got 3 witnesses to sign it, and sent the document to the U.S. Marshal's office in St. Louis.
Caleb looked up. "Will that do anything?"
"By itself? Maybe not.
But if we can connect that document to the intercepted letters, to Cole's tampering, to Dillard's offer on your ranch, We start building something a federal judge can't ignore. How long? My contact's getting a copy of Margaret Price's statement. He'll wire when he has it. Could be 2 days. Could be a week.
Clara might not have a week.
I know. They looked at each other, and the weight of it. A woman they were both trying to save. A clock they couldn't see. An enemy with money and patience and men, pressed down like the July heat.
There's something else, Vivian said. She pulled a second piece of paper from her coat. This was posted at Miller's Crossing, nailed to the board outside the general store.
It was a printed notice, official-looking, county seal at the top. A hearing had been scheduled at the Red Creek Courthouse for the following Monday. Subject: the legal status of the Bennett Silver Claim. Lot 47, Red Creek Township. Petitioner: Franklin Yates, representing unnamed interested parties. If no rightful claimant appeared in person to contest, the claim would be reviewed for transfer. Monday was 5 days away.
He's not waiting, Caleb said.
No, he's accelerating. Clara's locked up in Kansas City. You haven't registered anything in Cheyenne. And with this hearing, Dillard gets a legal window to challenge the claim while Clara can't be present to defend it.
Can we contest it?
Not without Clara, and not without proof of fraud. Vivian stood up and paced.
But if we can get Margaret Price's statement, plus the intercepted letters, plus testimony about Cole's behavior, we can file an injunction to delay the hearing. Buy time.
Where do we file? Laramie, Federal Courthouse. It's a 2-day ride. Then we ride. One of us rides. The other stays. No. Caleb stood, and his voice carried an edge that surprised both of them. I'm done sitting on this porch while you ride into trouble alone. We go together, or we don't go. Vivian opened her mouth to argue, and Caleb stepped forward. You told me to trust you. I did. Now I'm asking you to trust me back. I ain't a Pinkerton, and I ain't a lawyer. But I know this territory. I know the trails. I know the people. And I know that if you ride to Laramie alone and something happens, there ain't nobody left to fight for Clara. Vivian stared at him. Her jaw worked, and he could see the war behind her eyes. The part of her that had been alone so long she'd forgotten how to let someone in, fighting against the part of her that knew he was right. If we leave, she said slowly, the ranch is unprotected. I'll ask Ruth Calloway to send her nephew. He's 17, and he can shoot. That's a boy, Mercer, against Dillard's men. It's a boy with a rifle on a porch, and that's enough to make someone think twice about trespassing. We won't be gone more than 3 days. Vivian was quiet for a long time. The wind picked up and blew hot across the yard, and somewhere a gate hinge creaked. Fine, she said. We leave at dawn. They didn't leave at dawn. At 3 a.m, Caleb woke to the smell of smoke. He was on his feet before his mind caught up with his body. The smell was sharp, acrid, wrong. He grabbed his rifle and threw open the front door. The barn was burning. Not fully, not yet. Flames licked up one side where someone had thrown something against the wall. Kerosene. He could smell it, sweet and chemical, cutting through the wood smoke. Vivian! She was already beside him, Colt drawn, eyes scanning the dark. 2 riders, she said, headed north. They threw the fire and ran. The horses! Caleb sprinted for the barn. The fire was climbing fast on the dry summer wood, crackling and popping and throwing wild shadows. He could hear the horses inside, screaming that terrible sound that horses make when they're scared. High, raw, desperate. He hit the barn door with his shoulder. The latch was jammed. He hit it again. The wood splintered. Mercer, move! Vivian shoved past him and kicked the latch clean off its mount. The door swung wide, and heat rolled out like a wall. 2 horses, his bay gelding and the mare Vivian had been riding. They were rearing in their stalls, eyes rolling white, hooves crashing against the boards. Caleb grabbed the gelding's halter and dragged him out. The horse fought him every step, jerking and twisting, and a burning piece of timber fell from the overhead beam and hit Caleb's shoulder. Pain shot through his arm like lightning. He held on. He held on because letting go meant losing the only horse he had, and because the last time fire had taken something from him, he'd been too young and too small to stop it. Not this time. He pulled the gelding clear of the barn and slapped its hindquarters. The horse bolted into the yard. Behind him, Vivian was wrestling the mare out. The fire was bigger now, eating up the far wall, and the smoke was thick and black and choking. Vivian had her bandana over her mouth, and she was pulling the mare by the mane because the halter had broken, and the mare was fighting her with everything it had. "Come on!" Vivian snarled through the cloth. "Come on, you stubborn—" The mare reared. A hoof caught Vivian across the forearm. She grunted, but didn't let go. She wrapped both arms around the mare's neck and threw her weight sideways, dragging the animal toward the door by sheer force and fury. They stumbled out together, woman and horse, and collapsed in the dirt, 10 feet from the barn. Caleb grabbed the mare's broken halter and pulled her further away, while Vivian rolled onto her back and coughed smoke out of her lungs. The barn burned. They stood side by side and watched it. There was nothing they could do. No bucket brigade, no creek close enough, no miracle. The fire ate through the beams and the stored hay, and Caleb's tools and the saddle rack he'd built, and the extra fence posts he'd cut and stacked last month. Caleb's shoulder throbbed where the timber had hit. He could feel the burn through his shirt, hot and raw, and he knew without looking that the skin was blistered. "You're hurt," Vivian said. "I'm standing." "Your shoulder." "I said I'm standing." Vivian pulled his shirt collar aside and looked at the burn. Her fingers were surprisingly gentle, and Caleb flinched, not from the pain, but from the touch. The simple, unexpected fact of someone's hand on his skin, careful and concerned. "It's not deep," she said, "but it needs cleaning." "After." "After what?" "After we figure out what comes next." Vivian dropped her hand. She looked at the burning barn, then at him, and something shifted in her face. Not softness, something harder than that. Resolve. The kind that comes when someone stops being careful and starts being certain. "We don't go to Laramie," she said. "What?" "They want us gone. That's what this was. Not the barn. The barn's just the push. They want us scared enough to run, or angry enough to ride out and leave the ranch empty. Either way, Dillard wins." "So, we stay?" "We stay, and we fight from here." Vivian wiped soot from her face. "But we do it different. We stop being defensive. We stop waiting for Dillard's next move." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we go after him." Caleb stared at her. The fire crackled and popped behind them, and the first gray light of dawn was bleeding into the sky. "How?" "Dillard's power comes from secrecy. Nobody in Red Creek knows what he's really doing because he keeps everything behind closed doors. Cole does his dirty work. Yates handles the legal fraud from a distance, and everyone in town just sees a respectable businessman who donates to the church." Vivian's voice was steady now, almost calm, the way a river goes calm right before it drops over a falls. "We take that away. We make it public, every bit of it." "We don't have enough proof." "We have the letters. We have Dillard's offer on your ranch. We have Ruth Calloway's testimony about Cole meeting with Dillard. And when Margaret Price's statement arrives, we have Clara's own words about being taken against her will." That's not a court case yet, but it's enough to stand up in a town meeting and make people listen. A town meeting. Red Creek's got a charter. Any citizen can call a public assembly with 5 signatures. I read it on the board outside the courthouse. You read the town charter? I read everything, Mercer. It's how I've stayed alive. Caleb almost smiled. Almost. His shoulder was screaming, and his barn was a pile of orange embers, and he had kerosene on his boots and soot in his lungs. But something about this woman, this stubborn, fierce, impossible woman, made the worst night of his life feel like it might be the beginning of something instead of the end. 5 signatures, he said. Ruth Calloway's 1. The Reverend might be 2. He's careful, but he's not corrupt. Doc Emerson. He treated Parsons' wife for nervous exhaustion after Dillard ran them out. He never said so publicly, but I saw the look on his face at the time. That's 3. Who else? Caleb thought. There's a woman named Sarah Greer. She runs the laundry. Her husband used to work at Dillard's mining supply until he questioned a shipment that didn't add up. Fired the next day. Nobody would hire him after. They barely survived the winter. 4. And me. That's 5. Vivian nodded. We need those signatures before Monday, before that hearing. If we can call a public assembly and lay out what Dillard's done, not just to Clara, but to Parsons, to Greer, to anyone who's crossed him, we turn this from a land dispute into a scandal. And a scandal is the one thing Horace Dillard can't buy his way out of. He'll come after us harder. He's already burning our barn, Mercer. How much harder does it get? Caleb looked at the smoking ruin where his barn used to be. He thought about the saddle rack he'd built, the extra stall he'd added for Clara's horse, a horse she'd never ridden, for a woman he'd never met. All right, he said. We do it your way. Our way. He looked at her. Our way, she said again, quieter this time. I ain't doing this alone anymore, and neither are you. Something broke open in Caleb's chest. Not pain, not grief, but something older and deeper. The wall he'd built when he was 16 years old, standing in ashes, swearing he'd never need anyone again. It cracked. Not all the way, but enough. I'll ride to town at first light, he said. Talk to Ruth first, then the Reverend. I'll go to Sarah Greer, and I need to check the telegraph at Miller's Crossing again. If Margaret Price's statement came through, you're not riding with that arm. Vivian looked down at her forearm, where the mare's hoof had caught her. It was swollen and already turning purple. She flexed her fingers and winced. I've ridden with worse. I don't doubt it, but you ain't riding with worse today. Caleb's voice was steady, not commanding, not possessive, just firm, the way a man sounds when he's asking someone to let him help because he cares, not because he thinks she can't manage. Vivian studied him for a long, quiet moment. Fine. I'll go to Sarah Greer on foot. She's only a mile past the creek. She paused. But I'm taking my gun. I'd be worried if you weren't. Dawn came full and hot, and they parted at the gate. Caleb on the gelding toward town, Vivian on foot toward the Greer homestead. Both of them carrying something they hadn't carried the day before. Not just purpose, not just anger. Something that felt, against all odds and reason, like hope. Ruth Calloway signed without hesitation. She sat at her boarding house desk, read the petition Caleb had written out on the back of a feed receipt, and put her name down in bold, slanting letters. About damn time, she said. Reverend Macklin was harder. He sat in his study with his hands folded and his face arranged in that careful, pastoral expression that could mean anything from deep prayer to deep cowardice. Caleb, you're asking me to publicly accuse the most powerful man in this town of crimes I can't personally verify. I'm asking you to sign a petition for a public assembly. That's all. Let the people of Red Creek hear the evidence and decide for themselves. And if Dillard retaliates, he funds half this church's roof repairs. Reverend, a woman is locked in a sanitarium in Kansas City because Horace Dillard wants her land. My barn was burned last night by men he hired. And Deputy Cole is tampering with federal mail. If your roof matters more than that, then I reckon you and the Almighty have a different arrangement than I thought. Macklin's face went red, then white. Then he reached for the pen. God forgive me if I'm wrong, he said. He'll forgive you faster for this than for staying quiet. Macklin signed. Doc Emerson signed in his office between patients, with a grim nod and a muttered, "Should have done this 2 years ago." That was 4. Caleb rode back to the ranch and found Vivian sitting on the porch with her arm wrapped in a wet cloth and a look on her face that he couldn't read. "Sarah Greer?" he asked. "Signed. She cried first. Then she signed." Vivian held up a piece of paper. "And she gave me something else." Her husband kept a ledger from when he worked at Dillard's supply store. Shipment records. 3 entries don't match the inventory reports filed with the county. Dillard's been underreporting silver yields to avoid territorial taxes. Caleb took the paper. His hands were shaking, and he didn't care. "That's not just a land grab," he said. "That's tax fraud. That's a federal offense, and it gives us something the town meeting can't ignore." Vivian stood. "We've got 5 signatures. We file the petition tomorrow. The assembly meets before Monday's hearing, and when it does, we lay every single piece of this in front of the whole town. Dillard will try to stop it. Let him try. He's got coal. He's got hired men. He burned my barn without blinking. And we've got 5 people who are done being afraid." Vivian stepped closer to him. 6, counting you. 7, counting me. You ain't a citizen of Red Creek. No, but I'm the woman who's standing next to you. And right now, that counts for something. Caleb looked at her. Soot still streaked her cheek. Her arm was bruised and swollen. Her eyes were bloodshot from smoke and sleeplessness. And she was the most certain person he had ever met. "It counts for a lot," he said quietly. Vivian held his gaze for 1 beat longer than necessary. Then she looked away. "We should eat," she said. "Still got half that pie." "Cold pie for supper." "I've had worse." "So have I." They went inside, and behind them the barn smoldered and the night settled in, and 5 signatures sat on a feed receipt that was about to shake Red Creek to its foundations. But neither of them heard the horse that stopped on the ridge above the ranch, and neither of them saw the rider who sat motionless in the dark, watching the lamplight in the kitchen window, before turning and galloping hard toward town. The rider who watched from the ridge was back in Dillard's office before midnight. Caleb and Vivian didn't know that yet. What they knew was this. They had 5 signatures, a petition for a public assembly, a dead barn, a bruised arm, a burned shoulder, and 5 days before a hearing that would steal a woman's land while she sat locked in a sanitarium 1,000 miles away. They filed the petition at the courthouse at 8 o'clock the next morning. The clerk was a thin man named Harold Booth, who wore spectacles and moved like he was afraid of making noise. He read the petition twice, adjusted his glasses 3 times, and looked at Caleb like he'd just handed him a rattlesnake. "This is... Mr. Mercer, this calls for a public assembly." "I know what it calls for, Harold. I wrote it." "Against Mr. Dillard?" "It don't name Mr. Dillard. It calls for a public discussion of land claim irregularities in Red Creek Township. That's within the town charter." Harold looked at Vivian, who stood beside Caleb with her injured arm held close to her body and her good hand resting on her hip 6 inches from her colt. "Ma'am, you're not a resident of—" "I'm a witness. Witnesses don't need residency." Harold swallowed hard. He stamped the petition, logged it in the county record book, and told them the assembly would be scheduled for Saturday morning, 2 days before Monday's hearing. "Thank you, Harold," Caleb said. "Mr. Mercer?" Harold leaned forward and dropped his voice. "You should know that I'm required to post this on the public board and notify all named parties within 24 hours. "I know. Which means Mr. Dillard's attorney will be notified. I'm counting on it." They walked out of the courthouse into the morning heat, and Caleb felt the eyes of Red Creek on him like sunlight through a magnifying glass. People on the street stopped talking. Mrs. Pruitt turned her back. Old Henry at the general store watched from his doorway with an expression Caleb couldn't read. Fear, maybe, or something close to admiration, trying hard not to show itself. "Word's already out," Vivian said. "Good. Let it spread." They were halfway to the wagon when a voice stopped them cold. "Mr. Mercer." Caleb turned. Horace Dillard stood on the steps of his hotel across the street. He was a man of about 55, well-dressed in a dark suit with a gold watch chain, and a face that could have belonged to a banker or a preacher. Smooth, controlled, and utterly without warmth. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "A word, if you have a moment." Caleb glanced at Vivian. She gave the smallest shake of her head. He walked across the street anyway. Dillard smiled the way a man smiles when he's about to explain something to a child. "I see you've been busy this morning." "I filed a petition. That's my right." "It is. It surely is. This is a free territory, and every man has the right to embarrass himself in public." Dillard folded his hands in front of him. "But I wonder if you've thought this through. A public assembly, accusations, emotions running high. In my experience, that kind of spectacle tends to hurt the man who starts it more than the man he's aiming at." "Is that a threat, Mr. Dillard?" "It's an observation." Dillard's eyes moved past Caleb to Vivian, who stood by the wagon watching them. "Your guest is an interesting woman. A former Pinkerton, I understand. Carries herself well. But Pinkertons have a reputation for stirring up trouble and leaving other people to deal with the mess. I'd hate to see you left holding that particular bag." "I appreciate your concern." "I'm sure you do." Dillard reached into his vest pocket and produced a card. "My offer still stands. $3,000 for your ranch." "That's generous, Caleb. More than generous, considering the current condition of your property." He paused just long enough to let the word land. "I understand you had some trouble with your barn." Caleb's blood roared in his ears. He looked at this man, this polished, careful, patient man who burned barns and locked women in sanitariums and bought deputies like feed sacks, and something inside him went very still. "Mr. Dillard," Caleb said, "I wouldn't sell you a fence post." Dillard's smile didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A flicker, a recalculation. "That's unfortunate," Dillard said. "Truly." Caleb turned his back on him and walked to the wagon. He climbed up beside Vivian and took the reins. "What did he say?" Vivian asked. "Nothing he hasn't been saying all along, just louder." They drove out of town, and Caleb didn't look back, but Vivian did. She saw Dillard standing on those hotel steps watching them go. And she saw Deputy Cole step out of the telegraph office and cross the street to stand beside him. "They're talking," she said. "Let them talk. Saturday's coming." "So is whatever they're planning." That night, Caleb couldn't sleep. His shoulder burned under the bandage Vivian had cleaned and wrapped with hands so careful he'd had to look away. He lay on his bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about Clara Bennett, a woman he'd written to about creeks and mountains, a woman who was locked in a room somewhere in Kansas City because she'd inherited land that powerful men wanted. He got up and walked to the kitchen. Vivian was there, sitting at the table in the lamplight, with the Greer ledger spread out in front of her. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. "I keep looking at these numbers." Vivian tapped the ledger. 3 shipments from the mine in April alone that aren't in the county records. Silver ore. Significant quantities. Dillard's been skimming for at least 2 years. How much? Enough to make a federal tax inspector very interested. Caleb sat down across from her. The lamp cast long shadows, and her face was half in light and half in dark. And he noticed for the first time that her eyes were green. Not bright green. The deep, quiet green of creek water in shade. "Vivian?" She looked up. "After this is done, after Clara's safe and Dillard's finished, what do you do?" She was quiet for a moment. "I move on. That's what I do. That's what I've always done." "Does it ever get tired, moving on?" "Every single day." "Then why do it?" She closed the ledger slowly. "Because staying means trusting that the place you stay will hold. And in my experience, places don't hold. People don't hold. Everything good I've ever had has come with an expiration date, and I'd rather leave on my own terms than wait for someone to show me the door." Caleb leaned forward. "Nobody's showing you any door. You don't know that. I know I built a spare room for a woman I'd never met because her letters made me believe something. I know that woman never came, and instead, I got you. And I know that whatever happens Saturday, whatever happens with Dillard, whatever happens with Clara, I ain't sorry you're the one who stepped off that stagecoach." The words hung in the air between them. Vivian's hands were flat on the table, and Caleb could see them trembling, just barely, like a held breath. "Mercer." "Caleb," she closed her eyes. "Caleb, don't say things you'll have to take back." "I ain't taking anything back." She opened her eyes, and they were bright with something she was fighting hard not to let out. She stood up from the table abruptly. "Saturday," she said. "We focus on Saturday." "Vivian, Saturday." Her voice cracked on the word, just barely. She walked to the spare room door and stopped with her hand on the frame. She didn't turn around. "Nobody's ever built anything for me before. Not a fence, not a room, not even a place at a table." She paused. "I don't know what to do with that." She closed the door, and Caleb sat alone in the kitchen with the lamp burning low and the taste of something new and terrifying in his mouth. The knowledge that what he felt for this woman was not gratitude, not admiration, not the comfort of shared danger. It was more. And it scared him down to the bone. Friday came fast and mean. At 9 in the morning, a stagecoach arrived in Red Creek carrying 2 men. They wore city suits and carried leather cases and went straight to Dillard's hotel without speaking to anyone. Ruth Calloway sent word through her nephew within the hour. The men were attorneys. One was Franklin Yates, Dillard's man from Kansas City. The other was unnamed, but he carried a badge case in his breast pocket. "A badge," Vivian said when she heard. "Federal or territorial?" Ruth's nephew couldn't tell. "If Dillard's brought a federal man, he's playing a card we didn't expect. Could be a U.S. Marshal. Could be someone from the land office. Either way, it means Dillard knows about the assembly, and he's bringing his own authority." "Can he stop the assembly?" "Not legally. Town charter's clear. But he can show up with a man wearing a badge and make everyone in that room think twice about speaking up." "Then we need something stronger." At noon, Caleb rode to Miller's Crossing alone. Vivian argued, but her arm was worse. Swollen to twice its size, the bruise gone black. And they both knew she couldn't handle a horse for 40 miles round trip. The telegraph office at Miller's Crossing was run by a man named George Epp, who owed no favors to anyone in Red Creek, and cared about nothing except his fishing schedule and the correct operation of his equipment. "Got a wire for you," George said before Caleb even dismounted. "Came in this morning from St. Louis. You're Mercer?" "I am." George handed in the telegram. Caleb read it standing in the street with the sun beating down on his hat. His hand started shaking on the third line. He read it again. Then he folded it, put it in his breast pocket next to Clara's letters and Dillard's offer, and rode home faster than he'd ridden in years. Vivian was on the porch when he came through the gate. She saw his face and stood up. "What happened?" Caleb dismounted and handed her the telegram without a word. She read it out loud, and her voice changed with every sentence. Margaret Price's statement secured and notarized. Clara Bennett removed from Hargrove Sanitarium by U.S. Marshal Edward Phelps, pursuant to writ of habeas corpus filed by attorney James Whitaker, representing the estate of Thomas Bennett. Clara Bennett is free and in protective custody. Full statement, including testimony of illegal confinement, forged court orders, and conspiracy to defraud, being forwarded to federal court in Cheyenne. Clara Bennett requests message be delivered to Caleb Mercer. "I am coming. Hold the land. I am coming." Vivian lowered the telegram. Her eyes were bright. "She's free," Vivian whispered. "She's free." "And the federal court in Cheyenne has the case. Which means Monday's hearing is dead before it starts. If the federal court is investigating, no local judge will touch that claim. Dillard's hearing gets thrown out on jurisdictional grounds alone." Caleb sat down on the porch step. His legs felt like water. 3 weeks of fear and fury and sleepless nights, and now this. A telegram from 1,000 miles away that changed everything. "She said she's coming," he said. Vivian sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "She said, 'Hold the land,'" Vivian said. "So we hold it." "We still do Saturday?" "We do Saturday, because the federal case will take months, and Dillard doesn't stop just because he's losing. We expose him publicly, we take away his power in Red Creek, and we make sure that when Clara arrives, she's walking into a town that knows the truth." "And Yates, the man with the badge?" "Let them come. We've got Clara's own words now. We've got Margaret Price. We've got a U.S. Marshal who's already involved. Whatever Dillard brings to that assembly, we bring more." Caleb looked at her. Vivian Hale, sitting on his porch with a bruised arm and soot in her hair, and a telegram in her hand that proved everything she'd fought for was real. "You did this," he said. "We did this." "No. You rode 3 days in July heat to warn a man you'd never met. You stayed when you could have left. You got kicked by a horse, pulling it out of a burning barn. You walked a mile on foot with a broken arm to get a signature from a woman you'd never met. And you wired St. Louis and set in motion the chain of events that freed Clara Bennett from a locked room." Caleb's voice was rough. "You did this, Vivian." She didn't say anything for a long time. She just sat there beside him with the telegram in her lap. And the wind blew hot across the yard, and somewhere a meadowlark sang. "The girl I lost," she said finally. "The witness. The one I told you about." "I remember." "Her name was Annie Lowe. She was 19. She had red hair, and she was scared of everything, and she trusted me to keep her safe." Vivian's voice was steady, but barely. "I didn't keep her safe. I checked the wrong room. I was 5 minutes too late. And by the time I got there, she was gone, and nobody ever saw her again." Caleb was quiet. "I've been carrying that for 3 years. Every job I've taken since, every person I've tried to protect, it's been about Annie. About proving that I could get it right the next time." Vivian looked at him. But Clara's free. And she's free because I asked for help. Because I trusted you. Because I stopped trying to do everything alone. Her breath caught. Annie's gone, and I can't fix that. But maybe I can stop punishing myself for it. Caleb reached over and took her hand. She flinched, then held on. Her grip was strong, stronger than he expected, and her fingers were calloused from reins and triggers and years of holding on to things by herself. "You're not 5 minutes late anymore," Caleb said. "You're right on time." Vivian's jaw tightened. She didn't cry. She wasn't the kind of woman who cried easily, and Caleb respected that. But she held his hand, and she held it like it was the first solid thing she'd touched in 3 years. They sat on that porch until the sun went down, and they didn't talk about Saturday or Dillard or Clara or silver claims. They just sat together, two people who had been alone too long, learning what it felt like to not be. Saturday broke hot and still. The Red Creek Town Hall was a single-room building with a plank floor and wooden benches, and a raised platform at the front where the town council usually sat. By 9 o'clock, every seat was taken. People stood along the walls and crowded the doorway and spilled out onto the street. Ruth Calloway sat in the front row, with her arms crossed and her jaw set like a woman who had been waiting years for this moment. Dr. Emerson sat beside her, his medical bag between his feet like he expected casualties. Reverend Macklin sat with his Bible in his lap and his hands shaking. Sarah Greer sat in the back with her husband Tom, who was thin and hollow-eyed from 2 years of unemployment, but who sat up straight with his shoulders back. Horace Dillard sat in the front row on the opposite side. Franklin Yates was beside him, and the man with the badge sat behind them, a hard-faced man in his 40s who kept scanning the room like he was counting threats. Deputy Cole stood by the door with his arms folded and his hand near his gun. Caleb walked in, and the room went silent. Vivian walked in behind him, and the silence got louder. The town moderator, a retired attorney named Judge Haskell, who was 72 and answered to no one, called the assembly to order. "This gathering has been duly petitioned under Article 7 of the Red Creek Township Charter," Haskell said. "The subject is land claim irregularities. Mr. Mercer, you filed the petition. You have the floor." Caleb stood up. He looked out at the faces of his neighbors, people he bought supplies from, people he'd helped with fences, people who'd ignored him and whispered about him and watched his barn burn without lifting a finger. And he felt the fear rise in his throat like bile. Then he felt Vivian's hand touch his back, just for a second, just between the shoulder blades. Light, brief, gone. He opened his mouth and told the truth. He told them about Clara Bennett, about the letters, about the interception, about the fake lawyers in St. Louis and the forged court order and the sanitarium in Kansas City. He held up the letters and showed the resealed envelopes. He held up Dillard's offer on his ranch and read it out loud. He told them about the Parsons family and the barn fire and the cut fences and the sale at half price. Tom Greer stood up from the back of the room. "He did the same to us. I found shipments that didn't match the books. I asked about it and I was fired the next morning. Nobody in this town would hire me after. My children went hungry last winter." Sarah Greer stood beside her husband. "I have the ledger. 3 shipments of silver ore not reported to the county. My husband kept records because he knew something was wrong." The room erupted. People talking over each other. Mrs. Pruitt clutching her Bible. Old Henry shaking his head. Someone in the back shouted that this was slander. Someone else shouted that it was about time. Dillard stood up. The room quieted. "This is theater," he said calmly. A disgruntled rancher and a drifter with a gun have gathered a few malcontents to make wild accusations without a shred of credible evidence. I've served this community for 15 years. I've built businesses. I've created jobs. I've donated to every church and school in this territory. And you locked a woman in a sanitarium to steal her land, Vivian said. Every head turned. Vivian stood up. She held the telegram from St. Louis. Clara Bennett was removed from Hargrove Sanitarium 2 days ago by U.S. Marshal Edward Phelps. She was confined there on the basis of a forged court order arranged by your attorney, Franklin Yates. The federal court in Cheyenne has opened an investigation. Clara Bennett is alive, she is free, and she is coming to Red Creek to claim what is hers. The room went dead quiet. Dillard's face didn't change, but Yates, the attorney beside him, went white as chalk. "This is preposterous," Yates said, standing. "I don't know this woman. I have no knowledge of any—" "You handled 4 land transactions for Mr. Dillard's mining interest in the last 2 years," Vivian said. "The records are public, and the U.S. Marshal's office in St. Louis has your name on the court order that confined Clara Bennett." Yates looked at Dillard. Dillard didn't look back. That was the moment everyone in the room knew. Not because of the evidence, not because of the telegram, but because Horace Dillard, the most powerful man in Red Creek, the man who controlled everything with patience and pressure and money, would not look at his own attorney. The man with the badge stood up. He walked to the front of the room and held up a leather case. "My name is U.S. Marshal Thomas Harding. I was sent by the federal court in Cheyenne to serve notice on Franklin Yates regarding his involvement in the fraudulent confinement of Clara Bennett." He turned to Yates. "Mr. Yates, you are to appear before the federal court in Cheyenne within 14 days. Failure to appear will result in a warrant for your arrest." Yates grabbed his leather case and pushed toward the door. Cole stepped aside to let him pass, and Yates was gone. Out the door, across the street, and into the stagecoach that was still waiting at the depot. Dillard stood alone. The room watched him. Every face, every eye. 15 years of power, and it had taken less than 15 minutes to shatter it. "Mr. Dillard," Judge Haskell said from the platform, "do you wish to respond?" Dillard straightened his coat. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Vivian. He looked at Ruth Calloway and Doc Emerson and Tom Greer. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Yes, it is," Ruth said from the front row. "You just don't know it yet." Dillard walked out of the town hall without another word. Deputy Cole followed him. The door closed behind them, and for a long moment, nobody spoke. Then someone started clapping. Caleb didn't see who, but it spread. 1 person, then 2, then 10, then the whole room. And it wasn't applause for a performance. It was the sound of a town exhaling after holding its breath for years. Caleb stood in the middle of it and felt his hands shaking and his shoulder throbbing and his heart hammering. And he turned to look at Vivian. She was leaning against the wall with her arms crossed and her bruised arm held close and tears running down her face. She wasn't the kind of woman who cried easily, but she was the kind of woman who cried when she won. The applause died slowly, the way thunder rolls out after a storm. And when the last hands went quiet, Caleb stood in that town hall, feeling like a man who'd been holding up a wall and just felt it settle onto its own foundation. People came to him, shook his hand, looked him in the eye for the first time in years. Old Henry crossed the room and gripped his arm and said, "Your mama would have been proud, son." And Caleb had to look away, because the sting behind his eyes was something he didn't trust himself with. Not here. Not yet. Ruth Calloway pushed through the crowd and planted herself in front of Vivian. You, Ruth said, pointing a bony finger. You come to my boarding house tonight. I'm making roast chicken and you're eating it. Both of you. No arguments. Vivian opened her mouth. I said no arguments. Vivian closed her mouth. They walked out of the town hall together, Caleb and Vivian. And the street that had felt hostile 3 days ago now felt different. Not safe. Red Creek wasn't safe yet. But awake. Like a town that had been sleepwalking through its own corruption and had just been shaken hard enough to open its eyes. Doc Emerson caught them at the wagon. Let me look at that arm, he said to Vivian, and don't tell me it's fine. I've been a doctor for 30 years, and I know what fine looks like. That ain't it. He examined her in his office while Caleb waited on the bench outside. When Vivian came out, her arm was properly splinted and wrapped in clean white bandage, and she moved it gingerly, like it was a thing she'd been forced to acknowledge rather than ignore. Hairline fracture, she said before Caleb could ask. He says 4 weeks. You pulled a 1,200-pound horse out of a burning barn with a broken arm. It was only cracked at the time. Vivian. I know. She flexed her fingers against the splint and winced. I know. They drove back to the ranch in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than any they'd shared before. Not the tense silence of the first night. Not the working silence of the days that followed. This was the silence of two people who had been through something together and come out the other side and didn't need words to mark it. Caleb pulled the wagon up to the house and sat for a moment with the reins loose in his hands. Monday's hearing won't happen now, he said. The federal investigation kills it. Probably. But Dillard's still here. Cole's still here. And until Clara arrives and registers her claim in person, there's a window. How big a window? Small. Getting smaller every day. But a desperate man with money can do a lot of damage in a small window. Caleb nodded. He climbed down and offered Vivian his hand. She looked at it, his rough, calloused, fence-post hand, and took it. He helped her down, and when her boots hit the dirt, she didn't let go right away. Neither did he. Then she pulled her hand back and walked toward the house, and Caleb stood by the wagon and watched her go, and thought about what Ruth Calloway had said about her. That she was the kind who'd walk into a fire to pull someone out, and forget she's burning too. He thought maybe it was time someone reminded her she mattered as much as the people she saved. Sunday was quiet. Too quiet. Caleb worked on clearing the barn debris. There wasn't much to save. Charred timbers, twisted nails, the iron frame of a plow that had survived the fire, but nothing else. He worked with his injured shoulder aching and his hands blistered and his mind turning. Vivian sat on the porch with the Greer ledger and Clara's letters and every piece of evidence they'd gathered, organizing it into a packet to send to the federal court in Cheyenne. She wrote with her left hand, since her right was splinted, and her handwriting was cramped and ugly, and she cursed under her breath every third word, and Caleb found himself smiling without meaning to. Around noon, Ruth's nephew Tommy rode up to the gate. He was out of breath and his horse was lathered. "Mr. Mercer, ma'am, my aunt sent me. Cole's gone." Caleb set down his hammer. "Gone how?" "Packed his office this morning. Took his personal effects, his horse, and his guns. Rode south before dawn. My aunt saw him go from her window." Vivian stood up. "South? Toward Cheyenne?" "Or away from it," Caleb said. "A man with a federal investigation coming doesn't ride toward the courthouse. He rides away from it." "Did Dillard go too?" Vivian asked. "No, ma'am. Mr. Dillard's still at the hotel. But my aunt says he hasn't come out of his room since yesterday. Not for meals, not for anything." Tommy rode back to town, and Caleb and Vivian stood in the yard looking at each other. "Cole running is good for us," Vivian said. "It means he knows the game is up. Without his deputy, Dillard's got no one to do his work in Red Creek. Unless those telegrams from last week already brought more people. If they had, we'd know by now. Dillard's network is crumbling. Yates is gone. Cole is gone. The town knows the truth. He's alone. Alone men with money are still dangerous. I know, but they're also predictable. A man like Dillard, when he's cornered, he does one of two things. He either folds and tries to negotiate his way out, or he makes one last move, something bold, something desperate. Which one is Dillard? Vivian was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about that since yesterday, watching his face in that town hall. When Yates ran, Dillard didn't panic. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just straightened his coat and walked out. That scares you. That terrifies me. Because a man who can watch his whole scheme collapse and walk out with his back straight isn't a man who's giving up. He's a man who has another plan. The answer came Monday morning. Caleb was hauling water from the creek when he heard a horse coming fast from the direction of town. He dropped the buckets and reached for the rifle he now carried everywhere. And then he saw it was Doc Emerson, riding harder than a 60-year-old man with bad knees had any business riding. Emerson pulled up at the gate and almost fell off his horse. "Caleb, come to town, now!" What happened? Dillard's gone. Left sometime last night. Took his strongbox from the hotel safe and rode out. But that ain't why I'm here. Emerson was breathing hard, gripping the pommel. A stagecoach came in this morning, from Cheyenne. Caleb's heart stopped. There's a woman on it, Caleb. She's asking for you. Caleb didn't remember saddling the gelding. He didn't remember the ride to town. He remembered Vivian running out of the house at the sound of Emerson's voice and swinging up behind him on the horse, with her broken arm held against her chest and her good arm around his waist. And he remembered the road blurring beneath the horse's hooves. And he remembered the pounding of his own blood in his ears. Red Creek's main street was crowded. People had come out of shops and houses and stood along the boardwalk the way they had 2 weeks ago when the first stagecoach arrived. But the feeling was different now. There was no suspicion, no whispered scandal. Just a town holding its breath for the second time, hoping this time the story would end right. The stagecoach sat in front of the depot. The horses were still blowing. The door was open, and standing beside it, with a carpet bag at her feet, and a blue traveling dress covered in road dust, and her hands clasped in front of her like she was trying to hold herself together, was Clara Bennett. She was smaller than Caleb had imagined, younger looking, though he knew she was 28. She had light brown hair, pinned up in a style that had probably been neat in Cheyenne, but had come undone somewhere on the road. And her face was pale and thin. The face of a woman who had spent weeks in a locked room and was still learning what open air felt like. But her eyes were steady, tired and scared and determined all at once. Caleb dismounted. Vivian slid down behind him and stepped to the side. He walked toward Clara, and every step felt like a mile. She saw him coming, and something in her face broke open. Not tears, not yet, but the collapse of a wall she'd been holding up for a very long time. "Mr. Mercer?" she said. "Miss Bennett." "I got your letter. The one you wrote about the creek behind the barn, and the way the light hits the mountains?" Her voice trembled. "I read it 40 times in that place. They took everything from me. My clothes, my books, my father's ring. But they didn't find that letter because I'd sewn it into my corset lining." Caleb's throat closed. He stood there, 2 feet from this woman he'd never met, but had written to about his most private hopes and quiet dreams, and he couldn't speak. "You held the land," Clara said. "They told me you'd sell. They told me you'd give up. But you held it. I had help." Clara looked past him to Vivian, who who stood by the horse with her splinted arm and her dust coat and her colt on her hip. "You're Vivian," Clara said. "Yes, ma'am." Clara walked to her. She was a small woman, and Vivian was tall, and Clara had to look up to meet her eyes. She reached out and took Vivian's good hand in both of hers. "You promised you'd come back for me," Clara said. "In St. Louis, the night before they took me. You looked me in the eye, and you promised. I remember. I believed you. When they put me in that room and locked the door and told me I was sick in the head and nobody was coming, I believed you. Every single day." Vivian's jaw tightened. Her eyes went bright. She squeezed Clara's hands. "I'm sorry it took so long," Vivian whispered. "You came. That's all that matters." They stood like that for a moment, two women who had never met before St. Louis, bound together by a promise kept across 1,000 miles of fear and distance. And the crowd on the boardwalk watched in silence, and more than one woman wiped her eyes, and old Henry blew his nose into a handkerchief and turned away so nobody would see. Ruth Calloway pushed through the crowd. "All right, that's enough standing in the street. Miss Bennett, you're coming to my boarding house. You're getting a hot bath, a hot meal, and a bed with clean sheets. Everything else can wait until tomorrow." Clara looked at Caleb. "Will you come?" "I'll come." "And Vivian?" Vivian hesitated. She looked at Caleb, then at Clara, and something complicated moved across her face. Relief and pain, and the beginning of a question she wasn't ready to ask. "I'll come," she said. They walked together, all three of them, through the center of Red Creek, past the general store and the church, and the hotel where Horace Dillard's empty room still had the curtains drawn, and the town parted for them like water around stone. Ruth fed them until they couldn't eat anymore, and Clara told her story. She told them about the men in St. Louis with their forged papers, about the sanitarium, the small room, the barred window, the doctor who wrote hysteria on her chart without examining her. She told them about the other women in that place, women who weren't sick but were inconvenient, wives whose husbands wanted them gone, daughters whose fathers wanted their inheritance back, women who had committed no crime except owning something a man wanted. "There were 11 of us," Clara said. 11 women in that ward, and not one of them was crazy. Not one. Vivian's hand curled into a fist on the table. "When the marshal came," Clara continued, "when he walked into that ward and read the writ, the doctor tried to stop him, said I was his patient and he had jurisdiction. The marshal told him to step aside or be arrested. The doctor stepped aside." She paused. "But the other women, the other 11, the marshal couldn't help them. He only had a writ for me." The table went quiet. "We'll help them," Vivian said. Everyone looked at her. "Margaret Price's statement names the sanitarium. The federal investigation into Dillard will open those records. If those women were committed on fraudulent grounds, the court can order their release." "That could take years," Clara said. "Then it takes years, but it starts now. It starts with your testimony." Clara looked at Vivian, and something passed between them. A recognition, woman to woman, of what it meant to be locked away and declared unfit by men who had no authority over their minds or their lives. "I'll testify," Clara said, "to everything." The next morning, they rode to the county seat together, Clara, Caleb, and Vivian. 3 horses on the road to Laramie, moving steady through the July heat. Clara registered her claim at the federal land office at 11 o'clock on Tuesday morning. She signed her name on the line her father had left for her, and the clerk stamped it and recorded it, and it was done. The silver claim, Lot 47, Red Creek Township, belonged to Clara Bennett, legal and unbreakable. She stood outside the courthouse and held the registration paper in her hands, and the wind caught it, and she held on tighter. "My father used to say that land is the only thing that tells the truth," Clara said.
It doesn't lie about what it's worth.
It doesn't pretend to be something it's not. It just is. Your father was a smart man, Caleb said. He was a stubborn man. I think you would have liked him. They rode back to Red Creek, and by the time they arrived, news had already spread. Dillard's hearing was canceled. His hotel was being managed by a temporary appointee while the federal investigation proceeded. Deputy Cole had been spotted in Colorado, heading south. Franklin Yates had turned himself in to the U.S. Marshal's office in Cheyenne and was cooperating. It was over. Not all at once, not with a bang or a final showdown or a villain dragged off in chains. It ended the way most corruption ends. Slowly, and then suddenly, like a rotten fence post that holds and holds until one day it doesn't. The following week, Clara moved into the boarding house permanently. She hired a surveyor for her land and began making plans, not to mine the silver herself, but to lease the mineral rights to a legitimate operation and use the income to build something her father never had the chance to. A school, she told Caleb and Vivian over dinner at Ruth's. For girls, right here in Red Creek. Caleb smiled. Your father would have liked that. My father would have said it was impractical and sentimental. Clara smiled back. And then he would have helped me build it. That night, Caleb walked Vivian back to the ranch. They rode side by side in the dark, and the stars were out in that impossible Wyoming way. Thick and bright, and close enough to touch if you forgot that distance is always greater than it looks. They dismounted at the gate, and Caleb unsaddled both horses, and Vivian stood by the porch rail where she'd placed her gun belt that first night. Except she hadn't placed it there yet. That was the future. This was now. And now she was standing in the dark with her arms crossed and her face turned toward the stars and something in her posture that Caleb had never seen before. She looked uncertain. Not afraid, not guarded, just unsure, like a woman standing at a crossroads, who could see both directions clearly for the first time and didn't know which one she wanted. Clara doesn't need me anymore, Vivian said. No, she doesn't. And you don't need a bodyguard. No. So there's no reason for me to stay. Caleb put the saddles on the rail and walked over to her. He stood close, but not too close. He'd learned that about her. She needed space the way other people needed air, and pushing into it before she was ready would shut every door she'd started to open. Vivian, I'm not going to ask you to stay. She looked at him sharply. You're not? No, because asking you to stay would mean I think you need a reason. And I don't want to be your reason. I don't want to be the ranch that needs protecting, or the man who needs saving. I've had enough of people staying because they feel obligated. Then what are you saying? I'm saying this place is here. I'm here. The porch you sat on, the table where we ate pie, the spare room where you didn't sleep. All of it's here. And if you ride out tomorrow, I won't stop you. I won't chase you. I'll miss you every single day for the rest of my life, but I won't chase you. Because you're not someone who gets chased. You're someone who chooses. Vivian stared at him. Her eyes were bright in the starlight, and her lips were parted, and her hand, her good hand, was trembling at her side. You're asking me to choose, she said. I'm telling you that you can. The silence between them stretched out like the plain itself, wide, open, full of possibility. I've never chosen before, Vivian said. Not really. I've run, I've fought, I've survived, but I've never stood still in a place and said, this is where I want to be. Scares you? More than gunfire. Me too, she laughed. That same short, sharp laugh, the door swinging open to the room she kept locked. But this time, it stayed open longer. "You built a fence for a woman you'd never met," Vivian said, "because she wrote in a letter that she liked flowers." "I did." "And when she didn't come, you didn't tear it down." "No." "Why not?" Caleb looked at the fence. He'd built it in April, before the heat came, when the ground was still soft and the hope was still new. It stood there in the starlight, solid and straight, surrounding a garden that had never been planted. "Because I figured somebody might still want it," he said. Vivian was quiet for a long time. Then she unbuckled her gun belt. She held it in her hand for a moment, the weight of it, the leather worn smooth by years of carrying, the metal warm from her body, and she set it on the porch rail. "I want it," she said. "The fence, the porch, the table, the spare room where I never sleep." She stepped closer. "And I want the man who builds things for people he hasn't met yet, because he believes they're coming." Caleb reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his rough, calloused, fence-post hands against her skin, and she leaned into them like a woman leaning into the first warm wind after a long, hard winter. "Then stay," he said. "I'm staying." He kissed her, gentle, unhurried, a kiss that tasted like coffee and dust and the beginning of something neither of them had words for yet. She kissed him back, and her good hand gripped his shirt and pulled him closer, and the stars wheeled overhead, and the horses nickered softly in the yard, and somewhere a coyote sang to the moon. When they pulled apart, Vivian rested her forehead against his chest and breathed. Just breathed. "Caleb?" "Yeah?" "I'm going to plant flowers inside that fence." "I was hoping you would." The next morning, Caleb woke to the sound of someone humming in the kitchen. He lay there for a moment, listening, and the house that had been silent for 4 years was full of a sound he'd forgotten existed. He got up and walked to the kitchen. Vivian was at the stove, coffee made, her splinted arm propped on the counter, and her good hand cracking eggs into the skillet. She looked up when he came in, and she smiled, and it was the first real smile he'd ever seen from her. Not sharp, not guarded, not the beginning of something she was about to lock away. Just a smile, open and warm and his. "Morning," she said. "Morning." "Eggs are almost ready." "You cooked." "Don't get used to it. I'm terrible at it." Caleb sat down at the table, their table, where they'd spread Clara's letters and planned a revolution and eaten cold pie in the dark. And he watched this woman move through his kitchen like she'd always been there. And he felt something settle inside him. Something that had been restless and aching since he was 16 years old. Not gone, not healed all the way, but resting. Finally resting. 2 weeks later, the barn raising started. The whole town came. Ruth Calloway brought 3 pies and supervised from a chair in the shade. Doc Emerson held nails while Tom Greer hammered. Reverend Macklin carried lumber and quoted scripture between beams. Sarah Greer organized the food and bossed everyone around and laughed more in one afternoon than she had in 2 years. Clara Bennett arrived in a new dress with a sketch of a schoolhouse in her pocket and hope in her face that hadn't been there before. Caleb worked alongside his neighbors, the same people who had whispered about him, who had turned their backs, who had watched from behind curtains, and he didn't hold it against them. Fear does things to people. He knew that. He'd been afraid his whole life. The difference was what you did when the fear broke. Vivian stood on the porch and watched the barn go up, beam by beam, board by board. Her arm was still splinted, and she couldn't swing a hammer, so she did what she did best. She organized, directed, solved problems, and told men twice her size where to put things, in a voice that did not invite discussion. At sunset, the barn stood. Not finished. It would take weeks to complete. But the frame was up, the roof beams were set, and it was real. solid, something fire had taken and hands had given back. Caleb found Vivian at the new barn door, running her good hand along the frame.
"It's good work," she said.
"It is.
"Better than the old one."
That's usually how it goes. Things that get rebuilt come back stronger." Vivian looked at him.
"You talking about the barn or about us?"
"Yes." She laughed, that beautiful, unlocked laugh. Caleb took her hand. They stood in the doorway of the new barn and watched the people of Red Creek pack up their tools and climb into their wagons and head home, waving and calling out and promising to come back next weekend. Clara Bennett stopped at the gate and looked back. She saw Caleb and Vivian standing together in the barn doorway, silhouetted against the last light, and she smiled. A smile that held no regret, no jealousy, only the deep, quiet gratitude of a woman who had been saved by two people who didn't give up. She tipped her hat, a habit she'd picked up from Vivian, and rode toward town. The sun went down over the Wyoming plains. The new barn cast a long shadow. The garden fence stood waiting for flowers. And two people who had been alone too long stood together in the doorway and watched the first stars come out. And they didn't speak, because some things don't need words. Caleb Mercer had waited for a bride who never came. But the woman who arrived instead didn't need saving. She didn't need rescuing. She didn't need a man to give her a purpose or a home to give her a name. She just needed someone to build a fence and leave the gate open. And in the West, that made all the difference.